Hello, bonsoir and guten Abend. Ich freue mich, mit euch zu sprechen. I'm really pleased to be part of this event, the Casino Quebec, focusing on Quebec literature as a featured guest of the Frankfurt Book Fair, and also as part of the TOLEDO Cities of Translators project. My name is Sherry Simon. I'm delighted today to be having a conversation with Montreal writer Heather O'Neill and with her German translator, Gesine Schröder. I've been part of the City of Translators project for 2 years now. First with an expedition to Kolkata in India, then with the visit of the group to Montreal last May. I have lived in Montreal all my life, and I write about its neighborhoods and its languages. There are many ways to explore this idea of the City of Translators, but whichever way, Montreal and Heather O'Neill would find themselves at the heart of it. The translational city is a place of divides and interconnections. It sharpens awareness of difference. The writing of Heather O'Neill, anchored in the landscape, yet moving across languages and imaginary worlds, mirrors the relentless meeting of differences in Montreal. To live in a world of multiple languages is to be reminded of what is absent or lost in your own language, and to know the risks of falling in the spaces between. Discussing Montreal as a city of translators, our subject today, as a metropolis of plurilingualism and cultural diversity, is a natural topic for Heather O'Neill. She is the most Montrealaise of Montreal writers. Except for a few childhood years in the United States, Heather O'Neill has always lived in Montreal. She's published 3 novels, Lullabies for Little Criminals, The Girl Who Was Saturday Night, and The Lonely Hearts Hotel, as well as a collection of short stories, Daydreams of Angels, advice from her father collected as Wisdom in Nonsense, Invaluable Lessons from My Father, and a collection of poetry, Two Eyes, Are You Sleeping? She has won many awards, and last year she was awarded a major career prize, the 2019 Writers' Trust Fellowship. A German translation of her novel, The Lonely Hearts Hotel, will soon appear, and the translator of this novel, Gesine Schröder, will be part of this conversation. Gesine grew up in northern Germany, has spent time in England, Kansas, Australia, and India. She's been a freelance translator in Berlin for 11 years and has translated Louise Erdrich, Curtis Sittenfeld, among many others. Heather O'Neill is a Montreal writer. I think much of this interview will expand on what this means. All writers have their own urban geography, the map drawn by their experience and their imagination. Heather O'Neill's was for a long time blurry for me. In her first novel, for instance, Lullabies for Little Criminals, a story of childhood, innocence, and wisdom, cruelty, and imagination, I couldn't quite grasp what neighborhoods she was referring to. They were both familiar and strange. In a recent piece written for a magazine, I was pleased to read an unusual kind of atlas, a description of the kitchens in all her various flats, identified by age and neighborhood. 7 years old, Wilson Avenue. 17 years old, Clark Street. 18-year-olds, Saint-Dominique Street. 19-year-old, de Bullion Street. On to Bernard, back to Wilson, then Saint-Urbain at age 33. Each vignette evokes not only the place, but a moment, playful, evocative. For instance, on Bernard, she notes that my daughter sat on her high chair in the middle of the kitchen for most meals. There was always a group of plastic figurines on the tray. They would have to perform a small theatrical review before she took a bite. And she says in conclusion, the kitchen is where women have always been relegated. This one said that it was all right to put myself first, and the dishes would indeed wash themselves. This piece sums up for me so much of the appeal of O'Neill's fiction. The rich evocation of place, delicate stories of childhood fantasy and whimsy, fragility and violence. So perhaps I can begin by asking you, Heather, about this piece that you published in The Walrus. What inspired you to write it?
Well, first of all, hello everybody, and it's wonderful to be here with you, Sherry, and be meeting my translator for the first time. So this particular piece, I think that it just came to me as an idea to to tell a biography through the different kitchens that I had lived in, and how those kitchens would reflect the state that I was in. And I know growing up in Montreal is such a renter's city, and you just move from apartment to apartment, and it's almost as though you're going from one hotel to another, almost, because you only are able to stay in the same apartment for a few years. Like even now I'm in the process of being evicted, and it just seems like always perpetually being tossed out of one place and moving into another. So I liked these little visual anecdotal spots from which to just figure out where I was at that particular point in my life. So it started off as an exercise, kind of an experimental essay form, and then it just worked really well. And so it was actually it was a fun piece to write, because it actually did shape up in this kind of a really fun way. And then it was a fun piece too for the magazine that I submitted it to, because they had to fact check all that. So they had to go into the past and try to find these landlords or roommates that I had. And I don't know, it's just kind of fun when you write those nonfiction pieces, what it unearths and the different lives that you've lived, I suppose. But yeah, and it was a very kind of, I loved so many of those kitchens, and I love Montreal apartments because they have, some of them are so Victorian, and they've kind of, because Montreal was underdeveloped for so long, they were just left in peace, and they're like encountering this old person who has all these stories. So you would just have layers of paint and all the old moldings, and so I don't know. I'm always in love with different apartments.
You were actually brought up in NDG, which is a largely anglophone neighborhood in Montreal's West End, and you now live in the Mile End, which is formerly an immigrant neighborhood, now a creative hub, hugely gentrified, and quite mixed language-wise. So I was wondering, how has your everyday experience of language in Montreal changed?
From moving to Mile End?
Yeah, and through over the years.
Well, I mean, I learned French because my dad's girlfriend was French, so there was a lot. We just then it immediately the two solitudes met in the household. So it was I learned to speak French at home, but then I was kind of, you're segregated a bit because of the school system in Montreal. They send all the Anglophones go to one school and university, and all the Francophones go to another, which is a little bit devastating, because then that creates this, you've all had separate childhoods where you didn't get a chance to meet. So, I mean, I've always felt the effect of that. And then, I don't know, but things just end up being mixed up. Like, my boyfriend is Anglophone, but his children are Francophone. I consider them Francophone because they have little French accents. And when they get really angry and have to express something to me, then they switch into French. So, it's I mean, it's always kind of been mixed up that way, I think.
Did your father do that too? Because I just recently, in an interview in La Presse, I learned that your father was a francophone, and somehow that was never obvious to me before, though I've read so much of your work. So, did he speak French in the house, or just his girlfriends?
Well, my dad was half and half. So his father was French Canadian, and his mother was actually from Prince Edward Island, and she came to Montreal. And so he spoke both, and then he was because he was born in 27, he had 1927, so he had me later in life. So he had lived through the period of time where being a francophone was detrimental to moving up in class, and so he thought it would just be better off if I became an anglophone. So it was this sort of so he gave me this incredibly anglophone name, Heather O'Neill, which is not his last name at all, but so it was always kind of a funny
He gave
thing.
you the last name?
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay.
Is that shocking to you? Yeah, well, that's also like, it's sort of, yeah, because my dad was also always changing his name. So himself, he was kind of lived in a fictional idea of self where you could just change your name and reinvent yourself. And then he had this baby girl, and he thought, I shall, why not go off and give her an English name, and then she'll get better jobs and whatnot. And yeah, and even when I always tell the story because I was nominated for the Governor General Award, which is a large literary award in Canada, and then I called to tell him, and he was like, "See, you change your name to O'Neill, and stuff happens."
That's great. So, how is your French now, and how much do you use it, and would you ever think of writing in French?
My French is fine. I did because I always consider myself an Anglophone just because I started writing in English, and that became my imaginary language, and it's a language I think in my head. And when you write in different languages, the language itself creates your style, and each language has different limitations and different possibilities that others don't have. So, yeah, I would sometimes think about writing in French, but it's hard to imagine who I would be because it's such a different, it would be like changing instruments. And just because I play the trumpet well, then someone hands me the trombone doesn't mean I'll be able to do anything with it. But I would sort of be interested to see how my imagination, like what it would be able to express and not express if I was doing it in French, because it does inevitably, it does shape, I think, the way which language you use kind of shapes the way you think and the way you express yourself and what tools they have. Like always, like even when we speak in English, a lot of times we use German words because there are just these German words too, like Schadenfreude, or that will express almost these emotions that Anglophones didn't want to admit that we had, but the Germans have words for them, so those come up. So it's, so different languages are more honest about certain things.
Well, in that line, I mean, these are very Montrealish kinds of questions because writing in English, writing in French have so much to say about how you situate yourself in your city and how you understand the city. And you say something really interesting in an interview about literary influences. And I'm just going to read this from another interview. You say, I mean, it's funny because when I think of the huge influences on me from Quebec literature, it's all the francophone stuff. I remember discovering Marie-Claire Blais and A Season in the Life of Emmanuel. She was writing about poverty and families living in cramped quarters, but also describing it with this sense of grace. And I read Gabrielle Roy and Michel Tremblay growing up. And then you conclude, and this is what I would like you to, you said, I think I'm writing in that tradition more than the Anglo tradition like Mordecai Richler and Leonard Cohen. Can you explain that a bit?
Oh yeah, so yeah, when I was young, I kind of read both in English and French, and definitely the the Quebec writers who are writing in French, just my sensibility was more provoked by them. They seemed to be writing more about where my imagination was, and it almost had a more European feel, and orphans lost in woods and doing terrible things. And it was everything that I kind of loved was in the Quebec kind of Catholic magical realist tradition that was much different from what was being written in English Canada. So yeah, so oddly enough, more of my influences came from French writing in Canada rather than English writing. And I mean, part of that came from, too, I think, because in Quebec there is so much emphasis on discovering one's own culture and heritage. So a lot of those authors, Quebec authors, were pushed in school, and they were given to us in high school. So I discovered them there, and that was just a wonderful thing. Like I discovered Anne Hébert and Mary Claire Blaise. Like our class went to see a reading with Mary Claire Blaise, which was so magical to me. It was, I think, the first time I'd ever seen a living writer, and she was too shy to talk, so she just sat next to an actor, and then the actor spoke for her, which made it even more magical. So, I do kind of like that in Quebec, and there was always for our cultural icons this this mythology around them, and building a legendary world for them. So I don't know. I always liked that, and I always responded to it. The idea of persona and inventing these magical worlds. Where, as I found in anglophone Canada, everything was a bit like realistic, and it's just an author. Come on, like don't. Let's not get carried away with themselves. They're just a regular person who writes these books, and the books are magical. Whereas in Quebec, it's like, no, the writer is somebody magical, and strange things are happening in their house, and that's where they live, and we must all like quiet. We're going to pass because they're as fairy-like as their creation. So I don't know.
I get it now. I get it. I didn't get it when I read it, but thank you, because I guess if you think of the tradition of Richler, Cohen, or who happen to be Jewish writers more than or as much as they are Anglo writers, I guess it's more of an analytical tradition and more psychological and more of sort of a deep analysis rather than a kind of a evocation of secrets and magic. And
well, I will say that the living in Montreal, there was such a huge influence, Jewish influence on storytelling too, just because the Jewish immigrant population was, and that is such a storytelling kind of community, and so that definitely I was definitely influenced by the Jewish community in Montreal. But as far as Mordecai Richler and Leonard Cohen go, one of the reasons I felt alienated from them as well was it was so masculine, and it was hard as a young woman to read some of the things that Mordecai Richler and Leonard Cohen were saying in their books about where they just objectified women, and it was so male. You're reading it and it's just so like they are the male writers, and women are sort of these skinny blonde things to be one has sex with, and they torment you because once you have sex with them, then they have emotional needs, and God, like this is so. It's very hard as a young woman to kind of like, to say like what young woman has Mordecai Richler as their favorite writer when he talks about women in that way. So obviously,
I
when I found
yes,
people like Claire Blaise or Annie Bell, then it
agreed.
was a female.
Yeah. Well, good. Thank you. That those are really good answers for me. um, let's talk now about your latest novel, The Lonely Hearts Hotel. So I'm going to ask
Mhm.
Gesine, do you want to tell us a little bit about the novel and some of your thoughts on translating it?
Yes, gladly. Yeah. So the novel, The Lonely Hearts Hotel, is set in Montreal, roughly between the World Wars One and Two, in the 20s and the time of the Great Depression. Mm, the protagonists, a boy and a girl, are raised in an orphanage, and despite the very cruel and abusive regime of the Catholic nuns in that orphanage, um, they turn out to be very talented and develop individual skills like Pierrot, which is the name of the boy. He's a great piano player and something of a clown, while Rose, the female protagonist, is a great dancer and performer, and has a great gift to make everyone laugh, even there. Mm. And so they're sent out by the nuns to rich households to raise funds for the orphanage. And that's how they developed the dream of producing their own big theatrical show. But as teenagers, they're separated, they're sent away individually and have to learn to survive in Montreal's underworld. And it's a long time before they reunite and before they get the chance to even begin to realize their shared dream. And that's when an image turns up that I really liked. They've managed to assemble a group of clowns and of chorus girls. And then it says, and I quote, part of the show was to take place under a huge blizzard. So the whole troupe furiously cut snowflakes out of the newspapers that described scandals and mob killings and trouble in Europe. So what I liked about this was there are these performers and they're literally taking these dark times as material to turn them into something magical, to make it part of their show. And that's why I also like the German title of the novel, called Träume aus Papierschnee in German, Dreams Made of Paper Snow. Because I think it's an image that reflects on the aesthetic of the whole novel, how there's there's dark descriptions of brutal hardships in there, like child abuse, like drug addictions, like the violent sex trade going on, and all sorts of crimes. But there's also always these magical moments and moments of beauty that that both these protagonists strive for and that they believe in and that the novel believes in. So I can highly recommend it, and it's a big love story, it's a life story, and it's a glimpse into the history of Montreal, which I also enjoy.
Would you like to? Oh, I don't know if Heather wants to react, or can you tell us a little bit about how you translated it? What were some of the challenges for you? What were some of the most interesting parts to do?
Well, personally, there was one thing that I discovered. I'm usually a very typical German translator, which means I'm a terrible nitpicker. Like, I'll find every little inconsistency and always say, oh, how can, the protagonist grow this length of hair in that time? It doesn't add up or something. But this novel really put me in a whole different frame of mind. I found that for this, it really didn't matter to me. It was about the truth of the images and about what they contain and what they convey, and not so much about whether every little detail in the plot really adds up. And I enjoyed that tremendously.
You mentioned something really interesting when you were talking about Montreal, and you said that unlike another city, what was difficult for you to understand in Montreal, or the extra layer of interest for you, was when you had to understand Montreal. You had to understand not only where the spaces were, but what languages people were expected to speak in those spaces.
Yeah, true. It seemed like there's another layer on the map of Montreal. It's not only a physical space and a social space, which the novel very nicely depicts how there's the rich neighborhoods literally above the poorer neighborhoods and the more creative ones. But also there's this language scape where I sometimes felt quite lost because my French really stinks, and I found it hard to figure out where I'd need it and where I wouldn't. Your protagonists, though, they seem to not even feel that language boundary, right? They have names that can be used in both languages, and they just they seem to comfortably slip in and out either of the languages. Is that right?
Yeah, I had because it's usually a choice that I make whether so for this novel, because Piero and Rose are able to, I mean, their gift is they're kind of able to slip in and out of any situation. So it would it would be that because it's a Catholic orphanage, they would have come from Francophone families, but they both learn English in their adolescence perfectly. So they I made them two bilingual characters. So in a sense, it didn't they could function in both worlds, where I've had one novel where the characters, their languages always kind of make it impossible for them to enter the other worlds. But yeah, and whenever I'm writing historical fiction set in Montreal, like now I'm working on one that's set in the Victorian period, it's always an issue of, well, would they be speaking French or would they be speaking English? Because it depends on which neighborhood they're in or what class they're in or who owns the factories and which level of boss you'd be speaking to. So the further up you move, the more anglophone they're likely to be. But then if you're talking to a foreman, then it's probably, or somebody on the floor of the factory, then it's going to be in French. So there are all those little levels of complexity with language that, yeah, it would be sort of, I mean, it's hard for me to even follow when I'm writing. So anybody outside of Montreal, it would just be an impossible puzzle. Like you almost have to grow up in here to have an intuition of when you would speak French and when you would speak English.
Yeah,
But
and then
it's a book
yeah,
that, go on.
you also mentioned that they can also sort of slip in and out of different social situations. They're also weirdly socially mobile. Like they both spend time in very affluent families or the top of the hierarchy of the underworld in Rose's case, and they also have a huge grasp on language. I found that very interesting. Rose is this big fan of Russian novels, and it shows in the way she speaks, while Pierrot seems to be like he's this sponge soaking up everything that sounds that sounds interesting and makes him sound interesting. That has been fun to translate that.
Yeah, and it was a funny thing writing because they were both so articulate, and then I had to explain. Okay, so how do you have these two orphans who came from this brutal orphanage, and why do they both speak in this very sort of magical, aristocratic way. So with Piero, he's just an incredible mimic. So every time he's around somebody, he's able to pick up on their mannerisms. So he just by witnessing, because he's a performer, just by witnessing wealthy people, he's able to immediately pick up those gestures, and when in need, he can perform being a wealthy person. And then for Rose, it was sort of like in Frankenstein, where like why is the monster in Frankenstein so literate? It's like he finds a trunk of books. So I was like, okay, Rose is gonna find a trunk of books too, and just like read all these things. So then it explains why she has all these. I mean, it was kind of fun because, and also in the book it's so much about levels of performance and who we are and who we perform. And at Bates, there was a lot of, because I wanted to look at performing being a female. So Rose is always performing, and the idea of whether being a woman is performative. So then I was just examining different ways of performing and how we perform class and how we perform gender and how we perform intelligence and just different things like that, because they're both performers. So and not only do they perform on stage, but when they're off stage, they're constantly performing different roles in order to succeed and manipulate situations.
Language is so important in your novels, and yet you treat them in really very, very different ways. I mean, French and English are the two protagonists in a lot of it, but they work in such different ways between Lullabies and Lonely Hearts Hotel, and then The Girl Who Was Saturday Night, which is such a fascinating book that plunges right into a very polarized period of Montreal history, which is the referendum of 1995, when Anglophones and Francophones were really at loggerheads in an extremely unfortunate way, let us say. And you write in English a novel that assumes a Francophone perspective, which is really a bold move in so many ways. It's a bold move politically, it's a bold move literarily, it's a bold move just imaginatively. You say that you wanted to tell this story from the other side. Why?
Well, I think there's something, I mean, just being an artist in itself, there's always, you always immediately go, like, our appeal to what hasn't been done, and then what is the most contentious way of doing something, or what is a way that would be problematic. Like, you never want to go along a path well traveled. It's always so exciting to just look at different ways of thinking and different modes of being, and in that way kind of language ends up exploding. So yeah, and it was just, I think we've had Anglophone perspectives on the no side. Like the no was, we don't want to separate from Canada, and then Francophone perspectives on the yes side, we should separate from Canada. So I just thought it would be interesting if I took on the yes side, because it's always been so inexplicable for any Anglophone in the city why on earth Francophones would want to separate from Canada when Canada is this wonderful country, and the arguments for separating seem so strange. So I thought it would, just to get into the heart of that, and the cultural reasons and the artistic reasons, because the reasons for separating were all sort of based in identity politics and just one's sense of self, as opposed to any economic or rational arguments. So it just seemed more interesting for fiction. And I don't know, and that seemed interesting to me, to write a book that seemed as though it was translated, but it hadn't been. So a book that was written in English that seemed as though it was translated from French.
Yeah.
And because that's such a thing, it's you just live that way in Montreal, where your work is always being translated from one language to another. And as a writer, like, how would you articulate? So I just thought it would be funny if I was just translating a
You might as
book,
well
and then
do
when
it
they
first.
speak,
You'll do it before.
yeah, yeah, and then it was like so, and then it's funny because then when the characters speak in English, the English is all broken and crazy anytime anyone tries to speak English in the book. Anyways, it's hard to explain, but it was a really kind of
But
fun
not,
exercise.
so the fun continues because then the book actually does get translated into French, which it
Yeah.
has been. And I mean, I haven't looked into how they did things like translate "My Christ of a coffee machine is broken, tabernacle
Hmm.
of the chalice." How,
Hmm.
that's obviously too obvious to translate into French. So you'd have to do something different because it's already, translated. You're just translating it back. But were you interested in the way the book was read in French once it came out? I mean, that's what's so interesting about this is that, as I say, the story doesn't end. You write it one way and then it goes back and then the story continues, but from different perspectives. So did you find the French readership interesting?
Yeah, I mean, we had, that was a book where the translation, there was so much discussion about it because originally it was going to be translated in France. And I had asked if it was possible with that publisher to have a Quebecois translator. And they said, well, no, because nobody in France understands like what anybody in Quebec is saying. And but then I was like, I just can't have this translated by a translator in France. Like they'll murder me back home. It's just these separatists speaking
Yeah.
like
Well, it was bad
proper
enough for your
French. It would be
first that your first novel was translated in French to sort of great howls of laughter in Quebec because of the Parisianation of the story, which was a very Montreal story.
I know, and I never lived that down. So I was like, I'm not doing that again. I just like I got so much flack for having yeah, my first novel was translated in French by someone in France, and Quebec audiences were just livid with me, and they were like, "Do you realize how ridiculous this is?" And I had to I didn't even understand some of the words, but actually, that book, after all that story, is it's coming out. It just got translated. Dominique Tin did a new translation of it. So there's going to be a new translation so everybody can settle down, and it's going to be in a Quebec French. And it was funny too because then my translator in Quebec, so she took the her original idea was just to take the translation from France and to tinker with it and change a few things that made sense, but she ended up just she was like, it's just, we'll throw out the entire translation and start from scratch, because that's how different a language gets when it's just moved across the ocean and a whole different history, and it just becomes in itself a different language.
So it used to be thought that, or I even thought that those first translations or the Parisian type translations of Quebec English novels from Quebec were just bad, but in fact maybe they do maybe they do a great service for their French audience. I mean, did that novel do well, even though that translation was considered inappropriate for Quebec? It
Yeah,
probably
did
was
very
quite
well.
appropriate for France.
Exactly. It did very well in France, and there's nothing wrong with the translation itself. It's a very good translation, and it worked perfectly for French audiences. So I often feel, I don't know, like if there's so much, you can have, I think I like the idea of two translations. Some authors insist on two translations, like a Quebec translation and I don't know, Français métropole. I don't even know what you would call it, French from France translation. But yeah, I mean, but when in doubt, I would just prefer, I guess, a Quebec translation because it just seems more true to who I am. And there's always sort of, I mean, I know when I travel, people have they have these strange ideas about Quebec French, so I always feel defensive of it. And they're like, it sounds strange. I'm like, no, it doesn't. It's beautiful. They're like, it's not how it's supposed to sound. I'm like, it is. It's exactly how it's supposed to sound. It's beautiful.
Good. So Jennifer Croft, the translator of the Polish Nobel Prize winning novelist Olga Tokarczuk, has said that she feels like her writer's psychoanalyst. She feels like she's inside her head, and sometimes she knows Olga better than Olga knows herself. So do you work with your translators? Do you feel that they're psychoanalyzing you? Do you have that kind of intimate relationship with them, or do they simply work with your books? And I mean, do you have a conversation with your translators? And has your work been translated into other languages as well, besides German and French?
Yeah, it totally has. But I look at well, obviously I'm not the best to speak for this, but I always look at translation as it's an art in itself, and they're writing a book themselves. It's sort of it's based on my book, but it's a book in itself, and I feel that it then belongs to the translator as an artistic project, and for me to input it's inappropriate in itself, because I always find myself I hate working creatively when some other artist is trying to impose their vision. So I always you just look for a translator that you trust and then let them do their magic, because at that point it's an interpretation of it's almost like putting on a play with different actors. So but yeah, no, I don't interfere. What would I say anyways? I don't understand the word German. That would be annoying.
Go ahead.
I would like to ask you some questions about your work at some point, but my questions are always pretty boring. They're always about like little details that you mightn't even have thought about, like what gender is this bus driver? Authors sometimes tell me, well, how would I know? but yeah, I might contact you via email later.
Yeah, usually when I get questions from translators, they're always like, what on earth is this? And I'm like, oh, it's just a chocolate bar we eat in Montreal. And they're like, okay, thanks. So.
Not exactly psychoanalysis.
No.
Yeah. You've said that Montreal inspires you because it's a magical place. Has Montreal stayed magical for you? Is it still magical? Is it changing its magic, or?
I think I do think it's still magical. I mean, the neighborhood I'm living in now, like I feel like there's parts of it that have been gentrified, like the Plateau and Mile End, and it's those areas are losing a bit of the magic, but I feel like it's just, I mean, that happens in every city. So I kind of came of age during a recession, and Montreal was so down and out, and I think probably the only people who enjoy a period of a city just like on the edge and totally everything falling apart is a 19 or 20-year-old who just kind of is gallivanting about having an expensive rent. So, but no, there's definitely something magical about it, and it's just always been less like the values in Montreal. It's always been a kind of bohemian city where there's been less emphasis on class and capitalism, or I like to believe, or maybe it's because I just always move from one bohemian neighborhood to another and follow the flux of the artists. But I don't know, 'cause even like yesterday, I just never get enough of like how quirky and strange Montreal was. Like yesterday, I went for a walk along St. Hubert, where they just have all these rows of windows full of mannequins in each of the stores, and each one seemed like some strange little play. And I don't know, I just get that feeling in Montreal where there's an attention to the strangest details that I never find anywhere else, and for no reason. You know, it's like, why do you have all these mannequins looking like they're having like a book club? So I just love that kind of, that little strange thing you always see in Montreal.
I just hope those stores stay open. I'm so worried about local commerce. In Montreal, it's everywhere, I guess, but especially Montreal. The streets have become so strangely unoccupied and deserted in many areas. It's very frightening, because in fact that's what has made it so. Those
Yeah,
streets have always been so.
yeah, and you had, and this like the strangest people owning shops, and yeah, you would walk into one and then no one wanted to serve you, and you're always like, why is this in business for 70 years, when they're all grumpy and they're like, I'm not in the mood to give you a cake today. It's like, well, this is a bakery, sorry. They're like, get out, we're having personal problems. But that was like, I was like, fine, I'll come back tomorrow. But now it's like, because the city's kind of on the rise, and it's like places like that just gonna like shut down. It's like, if you're yelling at your customers, you can't stay open anymore. And it's like, we lose a little bit of the magic in that too.
Yeah. So you've changed each one of your novels, shows Montreal in a different light. And you say you're working on a new novel now, which is great. So are you
Mhm.
always looking for new ways to convey that magic and the Montreal sensibility, new ways specifically in relation to language?
Um, I mean, not always specifically. It depends on the book. The one I'm working now is not specifically about language. This one's more about class and being a woman in Montreal. And I'm always kind of, I mean, being a woman in Montreal has always been a strange state of being, and kind of backwards in a lot of ways in the attitude. So it was always like it was like every other city, I guess, in North America, but lagging even a little further behind and extreme because of the influence of the church and whatnot. So this one is well, it's actually a retelling of the French Revolution, but it's done in Montreal, the turn of the century. So that, like, Robespierre is a young woman, and then Georges Danton is like a young woman. There's the Marquis de Sade, who's a young woman. So it's kind of dealing with, it's having the French Revolution, but taking place in Victorian Montreal. So they have to oppose. But anyways, it's complicated. But one of the fun things about researching was then I went in, I was really researching the Industrial Revolution in Montreal and how that happened, and what the factories were actually like, because there were so many factories and textile factories. So it was an interesting thing to explore, and how women worked in those factories, and like young girls, and what it would be like to come of age as like a young 12-year-old girl in Montreal in a poor neighborhood, where you would actually have to be working in a factory for so many years, and just the oppressive poverty and the way the shanty towns were built by the river, and then as opposed to the incredible, like, luxurious, like that was a time when the classes in Montreal were crazy different, and then the luxurious Victorian mansions were built. So it's kind of, it was one thing that was a bit inspired by the architecture of Montreal. Like, how do we have such crazy ramshackle little buildings that are barely standing by the river, and like whole neighborhoods that just collapse, but then we have these absolutely glorious mansions at the top of the hill. So I was kind of interested in let's do a tale of young girls on the top of the hill and young girls at the bottom of the hill, and if they met and interacted and came at odds, like, and how would they communicate? Like, how would you possibly communicate in that? Like, it wouldn't, even if you're speaking the same language, you would be just speaking such a different language of class then, from being educated in the finishing schools to just picking up odd little phrases in the factory floor.
Okay, look forward to it. Okay, I'm going to quote you. There was a day when I was a girl when I realized I wouldn't have enough time to read all the books I wanted. It was the first time I realized with certainty that I was mortal. I was 13 years old, sitting in a big leather library chair reading a book about Buddhism, which I was curious about, and it struck me. So my question, do you still measure mortality by the number of books you'll get to read, or not?
I mean, that's so funny. Like, I'm just discovering Buddhism, all of a sudden I'm terrified of death. But I think it's like like there's this level of intense pleasure that I get when I read that, and the pleasure and happiness is so deep that it somehow corresponds to a fear of losing it. And then I'm like, wow, like one day I'll be dead and I can't take any books with me into the coffin. And that always seems like the saddest thing. So I think it's that. Like, I still have this. And whenever I'm really enjoying a book, then I'm like, one day this will all be taken away. Or maybe not. Maybe there'll be some books in heaven. I don't know. Bookstore. Independent bookstore. We're in heaven. We can support Amazon. Where are your independent bookstores? So,
Okay, so just to end on another cheery note, you recently wrote a piece about art in the time of the plague.
yeah.
So can you talk a little bit about the role of art in times of distress and crisis like the present?
Yeah, it's almost art, like inevitably our art is going to be, because art just takes on, it's such a sensitive thing, and we each have our individual voices, but then there's a collective voice, and whenever you read different periods you recognize that collective voice. So whenever something traumatic happens, it invariably influences the way in which we communicate. But I think it's art in times of crisis always reaches out more. So yeah, because I was researching music in the time of the bubonic plague, and what had happened was that was when the first kind of colloquial popular songs started arriving, and before they were just written for the church, but they started being written for the people in an entertaining way, and even liturgical chants, like the priest would walk down the street because people couldn't really go to church, and then people would call from the balcony, and it started making music into a much more popular activity that you engaged in at home. And it's interesting now because I live in a Hasidic neighborhood and they're not allowed to go to synagogue anymore, so they all pray on their balconies. And it's just been such a change in the neighborhood because this was always something they did apart from the community, and now you walk down the street and it's just this kind of beautiful singing everywhere, and it just opens your perception to to that community in a different way. So yeah, and during the AIDS crisis in the United States, like so many of the artists who were working then started creating very personal forms of art so that they could just make themselves heard, just so they knew they existed, just, in their photographs of themselves naked or performance art in the streets, just to draw attention to the fact that they were human beings who needed, and they were suffering, and the rest of the world had to pay attention to them, even though it was a plague that was striking a marginalized group more. So, and I think now, in this time, there's so many artists who are just looking for different mediums now, even though they're locked in their house, to find ways of expressing and getting out on the internet in different ways. Like even now, what we're doing, I can't come to Germany, but it's like, doesn't matter, we'll find this way to communicate. So I think it always opens different doors. And we realize the importance of art and how, it's like it will find different pathways to get to people. So I'm kind of interested in the new forms that will come out of this.
Hopefully. Yes, well, thank you. I think that concludes. Thank you so much, Heather. Thank you so much, Gesine. I think this was a terrific conversation. I look forward. Heather, we'll have to figure out where exactly you live, and we'll meet on the street corner or 6 feet apart. Anyways, this was just terrific. So thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you, Sharon. Thank you, Zina. It's wonderful to see you, and one day hope to meet. And when I do come to Germany next year, that'd be wonderful. And Sherry, yeah, I'll see you on a street corner someplace. Okay.